So if you break your arm, an X-ray gives you this, clean, jagged white line. You can just point right to it on the glowing screen. And it's actually comforting in a weird way because it's visible. The problem is isolated, and the solution is totally obvious.
Right, you just put a cast on it and wait.
Yeah.
It's entirely binary. It's broken or it's not.
Exactly. But the moment you step into the world of mental health, that X-ray machine is just completely useless. We're suddenly navigating this diagnostic landscape that is the absolute definition of muddy waters.
Oh, absolutely. Muddy and, unfortunately, deeply misunderstood by most people.
Yeah. And today, we're going to try and clear that mud when it comes to depression. Our mission for this deep dive is to move past the casual way we all say, like, oh, I'm so depressed, my team lost, and uncover what is actually happening inside the body and the brain.
And that distinction is just so vital because, depression is currently the leading cause of disability worldwide. Yet the average time it takes for someone to finally ask for help is a full decade.
Wait, a decade? 10 years?
10 years, yeah. And that delay usually stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of what is actually happening to them. They think they just need to, toughen up, not realizing they're fighting a severe physiological battle.
10 years in the dark is just a tragedy. So let's start by decoding the diagnosis itself, because a lot of our cultural assumptions are just flat out wrong. When I picture depression, my mind immediately goes to someone crying in bed all day.
Right, the classic movie depiction.
Yeah. But the clinical reality doesn't always look like sadness, does it?
Not at all. In fact, one of the primary hallmarks of major depression is something called anhedonia. And it isn't sadness. It is a profound, terrifying emotional numbness.
Numbness, so just feeling nothing.
Yes. Patients describe it as a total loss of reactivity. So imagine sitting at your best friend's wedding. Your logical brain tells you, hey, this is a joyous occasion. I love these people. I should feel happy.
But internally?
Internally, the emotional dashboard is completely blank. Nothing registers.
Wow. That sounds worse than being sad, honestly. If you're sad, you're at least feeling something. I'm trying to imagine feeling absolutely nothing. Does your body feel it too, or is it purely like a mental blankness?
Oh, it's heavily physical. People frequently describe a permanent, heavy knot in their stomach. Their limbs feel like they are made of lead.
So even just getting up is exhausting.
Exactly. Making basic tasks like taking a shower feel like climbing a mountain. And then there is a very specific disruption to the sleep cycle. It's not just, tossing and turning.
What does it look like then?
Well, a classic clinical marker is falling asleep, but then your eyes snap open at 4 or 5 in the morning, and you are wide awake.
I always thought insomnia was just having a lot on your mind, keeping you from drifting off in the first place. Why the 4 a.m. wake up?
Because the body's internal clock, the circadian rhythm, is fundamentally broken. In a healthy system, your stress hormone, cortisol, naturally rises right before you wake up to give you the energy to start the day.
Okay, so it gets you out of bed.
Right. But in major depression, that cortisol release is dysregulated. It spikes prematurely in the middle of the night. So your brain is jolted into a state of high alert at 4 a.m., but your physical body is still utterly exhausted.
Oh, man. So it's not a psychological worry keeping them awake. It's literally a chemical false alarm.
Precisely. The hardware is misfiring.
Okay, so that's major depression, the anhedonia, the lead in limbs, the 4 a.m. cortisol spikes. But there's another subtype that looks drastically different to the outside observer, right? Called dysthymia.
Yes. Dysthymia, or dysthymic disorder, is a chronic, lingering sadness. Unlike major depression, you get that terrifying emotional numbness. People with dysthymia actually do react to the world.
So they can feel happy.
Yeah, if you tell a joke, they'll laugh. If they get a promotion, they'll feel a burst of happiness.
But I'm guessing it doesn't last?
It never lasts. They inevitably snap right back to a baseline of persistent, low-level sadness. They might carry this around for years, assuming it's just their personality.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. And what's really intriguing is how strongly this correlates with specific personality traits. People with dysthymia are frequently highly perfectionistic, or they carry deep-seated insecurities.
Why perfectionism, though? How does trying to be flawless lead to chronic sadness?
Well, think about the mechanics of perfectionism. It requires you to constantly scan your environment for your own flaws. You are in a permanent state of self-correction and internal tension.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you can't ever just relax.
Exactly. Over years, that chronic emotional tension just exhausts your psychological reserves. You never get to just be. And that exhaustion settles into dysthymia.
I'm really starting to see how complex this is. And then there's a third category we need to map out from our sources, which is the adaptive disorder. And if I understand correctly, this one is entirely situational.
Correct. An adaptive disorder is an exaggerated, debilitating reaction to a massive, identifiable stressor. You lose your job or you go through a brutal divorce.
Which obviously sadness is normal there.
Right. Grief is normal. But in an adaptive disorder, the reaction is so intense that you literally stop functioning. You can't get off the couch to look for a new job.
So how do a doctor and a patient distinguish that from major depression if they both leave you stuck on the couch?
Causality.
Yeah.
If that external stressor improves, say, you get a call for a dream job interview, your mood rapidly elevates. Your emotional machinery still works perfectly fine.
It was just temporarily short-circuited by a massive external shock.
Exactly. The system itself isn't broken.
Okay, let me try to visualize this. It sounds like major depression is like a broken thermostat. It doesn't matter how hot or cold the room gets, the system simply cannot register or respond to the temperature anymore.
Right.
And then dysthymia is a thermostat that works, but someone permanently glued the dial to freezing.
Yes, perfect.
And an adaptive disorder is a perfectly functioning thermostat, but you've just been thrown outside into a blizzard.
That is a phenomenal way to conceptualize it. It perfectly illustrates why a doctor can't just hand everyone the same pill or the same advice. You really have to identify exactly how the thermostat is failing before you can fix it.
Which brings up the million-dollar question. Why does the thermostat break in the first place?
Because I've always pictured depression as a software issue, like a bad line of code in your thoughts. But you're telling me we need to look at the hardware.
We absolutely have to look at the hardware. When we pull up brain scans of individuals with severe, untreated clinical depression, we can actually see physical atrophy with the naked eye.
Wait, really? Yep. Like the brain is smaller?
Yes. The frontal lobes, which govern your decision-making and emotional regulation, actually shrink in volume. And the hippocampus, which is critical for memory and learning, also loses volume.
I mean, how does feeling numb cause physical brain tissue to shrink? That's wild. It goes back to that stress hormone we mentioned, cortisol. In severe depression, the brain is bathed in chronically high levels of cortisol. Over time, that hormone actually becomes toxic to neurons, particularly in the hippocampus.
So they just die off.
They literally wither. And on a micro level, there are massive shortages of key neurotransmitters. Serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine are all heavily depleted.
Now, when you mention serotonin and dopamine, everyone immediately pictures the brain. But this is the massive twist that completely changed how I view the human body when I was reading through our sources. The majority of these chemicals aren't being manufactured in the brain at all.
No, they aren't.
They are coming from the second brain, our gut.
The gastrointestinal tract, yes. This is the absolute frontier of mental health science right now. There is this superhighway of neurons connecting your gut and your brain called the vagus nerve.
Right.
For decades, we operated under the assumption that the brain was the undisputed boss, just sending commands down to the stomach to digest food.
Yeah, it's like the brain is the CEO and the gut is just the factory floor.
That was the assumption. But the reality is a completely different power dynamic. 90% of the communication traveling along the vagus nerve is actually going from the gut up to the brain.
Wow. So the workforce is actually sending up constant status reports, and those reports dictate the CEO's mood.
Precisely. And who is writing those reports? Trillions of bacteria. Your gut microbiome.
That is just mind-blowing.
It really is. Your gut microbiome actually produces an estimated 90% of your body's serotonin. It produces dopamine. It produces GABA.
Okay, explain GABA to me, because that's one we don't hear about as much as serotonin. What exactly does GABA do?
Think of GABA as your nervous system's brake pedal. When your brain is speeding out of control with anxious, racing thoughts, GABA is the neurotransmitter that clamps down on the brakes and says, slow down, we are safe.
And our gut bacteria are making this.
They are a primary factory for this chemical, yes.
How are the bacteria making this stuff, though? Like, what's the actual mechanism?
It comes down to diet. When you eat certain fibers, the good aerobic bacteria in your gut ferment those fibers. And as a byproduct of that fermentation, they produce a substance called butyric acid.
Butyric acid. Okay.
Yeah, and butyric acid is a powerhouse. It reduces inflammation system-wide, and it essentially acts as a natural, soothing antidepressant for the vagus nerve.
Okay, hold on. Let me make sure I'm connecting these dots correctly. If my gut bacteria produce the butyric acid that keeps my brain calm, what happens if I take a standard broad-spectrum antibiotic for, I don't know, a sinus infection? Does that wipe out the good bacteria?
It acts like a cluster bomb. A broad-spectrum antibiotic doesn't discriminate. It kills the sinus infection, sure, but it also decimates those good butyric acid-producing bacteria in your gut.
And then what? Do I just stop producing serotonin?
Worse. When you clear-cut a forest, weeds grow back first. When the good bacteria are wiped out, different opportunistic organisms take over. We get an overgrowth of what we call putrefying bacteria.
That sounds terrible.
It is. Instead of producing calming butyric acid, these bacteria produce endotoxins. These toxins leak through the gut lining and trigger a massive inflammatory response.
And that inflammation travels up the vagus nerve.
Straight up the vagus nerve to the brain. It causes neuroinflammation, and we now know that an inflamed brain is a highly anxious, profoundly depressed brain.
So you could literally take a heavy course of antibiotics in March, and by April, you are experiencing a sudden, unexplainable depressive crash.
Exactly. The hardware was altered, and the software crashed as a result.
That is wild. A prescription for a stuffy nose could inadvertently rewire my emotional state a month later. It really highlights how vulnerable our internal environment is. But, I mean, we don't exist in a vacuum. The internal biology is constantly colliding with external societal pressures.
Just constantly.
And the sources highlight that this collision is particularly violent during adolescence.
Adolescence is a peak vulnerability window. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for long-term planning and emotional control, is still under construction. At the exact same time, teenagers are hit with fluctuating hormones and immense social pressure.
And if they develop depression during this window and it isn't treated, what happens? Like, what's the long-term impact?
The clinical data shows it acts as a massive multiplier for future risk. Unresolved adolescent depression triples the likelihood of developing further psychiatric disorders or severe substance abuse issues in early adulthood.
Triples it?
Yes.
Yeah.
The brain essentially wires itself to expect a state of distress.
Our sources actually have a name for this cascading effect. They call it the risk syndrome. It's this idea that depression in teenagers rarely travels alone. It hunts in a pack, co-occurring with dropping out of school, early pregnancy, and addiction.
And we really have to look closely at the environment shaping that developing brain. The family dynamic is paramount. Chaotic households, highly inconsistent discipline, parental divorce, these keep the child's nervous system in a constant state of low-level alarm.
Right, the cortisol just keeps pumping.
Exactly. But the most staggering metric we see is regarding trauma. A history of childhood physical abuse makes a person 7 times more likely to develop major depression later in life.
7 times? That is a horrifying statistic. How does physical abuse create that much vulnerability later on?
It's about how trauma physically alters the stress response. A child experiencing physical abuse becomes hypervigilant. They're constantly scanning the room for danger, meaning their body is continuously pumping out cortisol.
And as we discussed earlier, chronic cortisol damages the hippocampus.
Right, and it alters how the amygdala, the fear center, processes threats. Their alarm system gets permanently stuck in the on position.
So, if you are a parent listening to this right now, and you have a teenager who is suddenly acting out, their grades are tanking, they're isolating in their room, maybe you catch them drinking, is the rebellion causing their depression, or is the rebellion just a symptom of it?
It almost always functions as a giant flashing warning light of an underlying depressive state or severe anxiety. Teenagers generally lack the emotional vocabulary to sit you down and say, "Mother, I am currently experiencing clinical anhedonia."
Right, they don't have the words for it.
Exactly. So instead they disengage, or they try to self-medicate the numbness with alcohol or drugs, which tragically just damages their neurochemistry even further.
Speaking of societal pressures, there is a massive gender gap when it comes to who actually gets diagnosed with this. Women are twice as likely as men to suffer from depression. Is that gap purely biological, or is society driving it?
The consensus leans heavily towards sociological drivers. It is deeply tied to the roles women are traditionally expected to play. Sociologists look at something called instrumental and emotional support.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
Women generally provide significantly more of this within their social networks. They're the ones remembering the doctor's appointments, mediating family arguments, absorbing the stress of their partners and aging parents.
It's that invisible mental load we hear about.
Exactly. It's an accumulation of secondary stress. They're carrying everyone else's cognitive load, which literally exhausts their own psychological and biological resources.
And then you add other stressors on top of that.
Right. When you combine that exhaustion with external stressors like poverty, neighborhood violence, or being a single-headed household, the risk of the system crashing compounds exponentially.
Okay, if you are listening to this right now, I know this might feel incredibly heavy. We've mapped out the terrifying numbness of anhedonia, the atrophied brain volumes, the gut bacteria staging a coup, and the crushing social burdens. It's a lot.
It is a lot to take in.
So let's pivot and open the toolkit, because the science also gives us a clear roadmap for fighting back. How do we fix the thermostat?
The most optimistic takeaway here is that because depression is multifaceted, involving the gut, the brain, the environment, there are multiple angles of attack. You don't just have one lever to pull.
Okay, where do we start?
Let's start with the gut-brain axis. You can actively heal that vagus nerve superhighway. Clinical nutrition protocols recommend repopulating the gut with high-quality probiotics. And you need a massive dose look for supplements with 15 billion live organisms.
15 billion. That sounds like swallowing the population of a small country with your morning coffee.
Well, you need an army to reclaim the territory, and you pair that army with fermented foods, kefir, natural yogurt, sauerkraut. But here is the critical step most people miss. You can't just drop those bacteria in there. You have to feed them so they don't starve.
Right. They need what the sources call resistant fiber, things like green plantains or pea flour. But why is it called resistant?
Because it resists early digestion. Normal carbohydrates get broken down quickly in the stomach and small intestine. Resistant starch survives all the way down to the lower intestine, where those 15 billion bacteria are waiting.
Ah, so it actually reaches them.
Exactly. And they ferment that fiber into the beautiful brain-calming butyric acid we talked about earlier. Diet is quite literally a medical intervention here.
What about behavioral changes? I mean, when your limbs feel like lead, what can you actually do?
Movement is critical, but we have to be realistic. Nobody with major depression is running a marathon. The goal is moderate exercise, just a 20-minute daily walk.
How does a simple 20-minute walk fix a chemical imbalance, though?
It's about resetting that broken circadian rhythm. Getting outside, especially in the morning, lets natural light hit your retina, which signals the brain to regulate that cortisol spike and naturally boosts dopamine.
It tells the body, hey, it's daytime, we are awake.
Exactly, preventing that 4 a.m. misfire.
I love that. And for tackling daily tasks, the strategy from our experts is all about micro steps. When your frontal lobes are compromised, thinking about cleaning the house is an impossible mountain. But taking one dirty coffee mug to the sink is a micro step.
Yes, you do that one thing and you stop. You remove the cognitive overwhelm.
And speaking of cognitive overwhelm, there is a crucial warning regarding decision-making. Do not make any major life decisions while in the middle of a depressive episode.
That is so important. Don't quit your job. Don't file for divorce. Don't buy a house.
Just wait.
Precisely. Because, as we saw in the brain scans, the frontal lobes, your logic and reasoning centers, are physically atrophied. Your cognitive reasoning is genuinely impaired. You wouldn't make a massive financial decision while heavily intoxicated, and you shouldn't do it while clinically depressed. Delay those decisions until the fog lifts.
Makes total sense. And obviously, avoiding alcohol and recreational drugs is non-negotiable.
Absolutely. They are central nervous system depressants. They will only drive your already depleted baseline further into the ground.
Okay, so that covers the home toolkit. But when do we need to call in the professionals, and what does that actually look like?
Professional support is often the necessary catalyst to break the cycle. Therapy is the cornerstone. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, helps patients identify and actively rewire those negative looping thoughts that fuel the stress response.
And what if a doctor suggests antidepressants? I feel like people expect them to work like aspirin. You know, you take it and an hour later your headache is gone.
That is a dangerous misconception that leads many people to quit too early. Antidepressants typically take 3 to 4 weeks to start working.
Why does it take a full month?
Because it's not just about flooding the brain with serotonin. The brain actually has to grow new receptors and physically adapt its neural pathways to process those neurotransmitters effectively. That biological remodeling takes time.
So you have to be patient.
You really do. And in those first few weeks, patients might actually experience uncomfortable side effects before the benefits kick in. You have to give the chemistry the grace to heal.
And for the severe cases where medication and therapy just aren't moving the needle?
The medical community has highly effective interventions for treatment-resistant cases. Things like ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, or TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation.
I want to focus on TMS for a second because it sounds like science fiction. How do magnets treat depression?
It's fascinating, really. An electromagnet is placed on the scalp. and it sends painless magnetic pulses directly into the prefrontal cortex. That exact area we know shrinks and becomes underactive during depression.
Okay.
The magnetic field physically induces an electrical current in those sluggish neurons, essentially forcing them to wake up and start firing normally again.
It's literally jump-starting the car battery.
Exactly. It forces the hardware back online.
Now, I want to pivot to the listener who is sitting here thinking, I'm okay, but my partner or my brother or my best friend is drowning in this. How do you support someone with a broken thermostat? Because saying, hey, let me know if you need anything, feels incredibly hollow.
It's worse than hollow. It's actually counterproductive. When you say, let me know what you need, you are putting the cognitive burden of planning on a brain that is already paralyzed. Figuring out what they need and then finding the energy to ask for it is an insurmountable task.
So what's the alternative then?
Offer tangible, hyper-specific help. Say, I am going to research 3 therapists that take your insurance, and I will text you their numbers by noon. Or, I am coming over at 6 p.m. to fold your laundry. You don't even have to talk to me. Remove the decision-making entirely.
That is such great advice. And whatever you do, our sources emphasize, do not compare their clinical depression to a time you felt sad.
Well, please don't.
Saying, I know exactly how you feel, I was so depressed when my dog died, is a terrible idea because their brain isn't just reacting to a sad event. It's structurally stuck in a state of anhedonia. You're just making them feel more isolated because they know their experience isn't the same as normal grief.
And that isolation brings us to perhaps the most critical piece of advice regarding supporting a loved one. If you're worried about them, you must ask them about suicidal thoughts directly. Ask, are you thinking of hurting yourself?
I think a lot of people are terrified to ask that. There's this myth that bringing it up will somehow plant the idea in their head if it wasn't there already.
That is a myth, yes, and the data actively disproves it. Asking openly and directly actually reduces suicide risk.
Why does it reduce the risk? That seems counterintuitive.
Because it pierces the shame. When you ask directly, you signal to them that you see exactly how dark their reality is and that you are not afraid of it. It validates the severity of their pain without judgment, and it opens a pressure valve. The isolation is often deadlier than the depression itself.
Just the act of asking can be the lifeline. That is incredibly powerful.
Well, let's take a breath and look back at the map we've drawn today. We started by defining the actual monster, distinguishing the terrifying flat numbness of major depression and those 4 a.m. wake-ups from the chronic, tense sadness of dysthymia. Right, getting the diagnosis right.
We looked at the shrinking frontal lobes, and we discovered how a simple course of antibiotics can inadvertently wipe out our gut's butyric acid factory, crashing our mood. We examined the crushing invisible loads placed on women and the lifelong impact of adolescent trauma.
It's a vast ecosystem.
It really is. And finally, we built a toolkit. From 15 billion probiotic soldiers and daily walks to microsteps, jump-starting the brain with TMS, and the life-saving power of asking direct questions.
It is a complex whole-body map. But understanding the mechanisms, knowing why the body is reacting this way, is the very first step to navigating out of the dark. And I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over.
Okay, let's hear it.
If 90% of the communication governing our mood travels from our gut up to our brain, going back to what we said earlier, if it travels upwards and our modern world constantly bombards our digestive and nervous systems with highly processed diets, broad-spectrum antibiotics, sleep deprivation, and chronic, endless stress.
Where are you going with this?
Are we unfairly treating depression purely as an individual psychological failure? Or might it actually be a completely logical, natural, physical response to a modern societal environment that is toxic to our biology?
Wow. That completely flips the script. It means we aren't just looking at a broken mind. We might be looking at a perfectly functioning alarm system reacting to a broken world. We really have to stop looking for that simple X-ray and start respecting the complex, muddy, whole-body reality of what it means to be human. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. Take care of yourself and take care of each other.